Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jim Spears, and I'm the Director of Arts South Dakota, and I'm pleased to be here on a summer afternoon. Maybe some of you are joining us from a picnic table or a chair in the lawn or something, I hope. Summer's so short-lived here in South Dakota. We're excited to continue the webinar series. Traditionally, we slow the series down or take a little bit of a break in the summer, but we have a series for you this summer on a very important topic. But first, I just want to promote and remind everyone that we've now done, boy, I should have looked the number up, but several. I mean, we're probably at a dozen or more webinars over the course of the last few years, and those are all archived on artsouthdakota.org. So check out the site. You can go to the webinar archive. There's lots of great information there. And I want to thank our team at Arts South Dakota, Sherry Cosell, who is out in Rapid City, and lead out in the west side of the state. And then our colleagues here in Sioux Falls, Andrew Reinhardt and Sarah Larson. We're excited to bring this series to you. I think this is an important topic, one that continues to be discussed and refined and reformed. And it's a very broad topic. Accessibility means so many things. So we're looking forward to a series with several experts and some folks that are doing really creative and innovative work in the field around this topic. First, I want to say thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts for your support. Your direct support of Arts South Dakota is what has made many of these webinars and our professional development programs possible. So thank you to Beth and Katharine from the National Endowment for the Arts. And then also I want to say special thanks to our friends and colleagues in Pierre at the South Dakota Arts Council. We were just out in Lead last week, in fact, and had a chance to get together with folks from the Arts Council and from Arts Midwest. And we have such a great team, and we're so thankful for that partnership, and especially for Kate, who's joining us from the South Dakota Arts Council today. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Andrew, and I am looking forward to this session. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. And as you mentioned, we have to say thank you to the South Dakota Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Bush Foundation, whose funding and support has really made these sessions possible. And also, I realized I forgot to add one slide, so I'm going to share this one. For those of you that are on today's session, we do have two more as a part of this current series, which we're really definitely treating as a kickoff to a much longer conversation over the coming months, leading up to additional webinars, some in-person events potentially at the State Arts Conference coming up, and others to really keep this conversation moving beyond just a couple of these first conversations. But in 2 weeks, we have an Arts Access panel, which is really going to be exciting because we have Dan Kleberg from Aberdeen with the Fallout Creative Community, Nancy Halverson from the Levitt at the Falls and Sioux Falls, and Heather Pickering with Flutter Productions out in Rapid City. All three of these organizations and leaders have been doing really interesting, powerful work with accessibility, whether that's the accessibility in experiencing arts events as a audience member, but also in particular with experiencing the arts as creators and having a really wide range of folks involved in the arts experience. And then finally, we'll have Kate Vandell and the South Dakota Arts Council back with us in the middle of July to walk through their changes to some of their grants and their accessibility checklist that they will be using with grantees moving forward. So then really quick, just a little bit of housekeeping. If I can get back to the other one. If you would, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to share your questions, and I will bring those to our panelists. Feel free to use the chat if you have any technical issues, any other questions, and just to say hello to your colleagues from around the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our great guests, Beth and Katharine from the National Endowment for the Arts, and we're just so grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, Jim, and also Kate, and the Arts South Dakota and the South Dakota Arts Council. We so appreciate you inviting us to talk about this very important topic. While I'm going to just give a quick introduction, and then while I'm doing that, I will share my screen. So, oh, sorry, I didn't share the right part. Hold on. Let's see. Sorry, I had this all ready to go. And of course, 3 years into this, we still don't quite have it. All right, so are you all seeing a slide?
Looks great.
Great, all right. So my name is Beth Bienvenu. I am the Director of Accessibility at the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair with a blurred background and a black and white print top. I am also a person who stutters, so you might hear that pop out on occasion, but I don't tend to stutter in this type of environment because you're all so polite and easy to talk with. So I'd like to reiterate that to put your questions in the chat. I guess there's also the Q&A button. We'd love to hear a bit about your experience with accessibility. What are your challenges, and what are you hoping to get from this series? We're always interested in what's going on in the field, and what questions you might have, and what type of challenges you might have. But I will quickly turn it over to Katharine to introduce herself before we continue.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katharine Hayward. I am the accessibility specialist working in the Office of Accessibility with Beth. I am a pale white woman with long, brown, thick, curly hair that I have tied back in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a green and black checkered collared dress and have a blurred background.
Thank you. So I'm so happy to have Katharine here with us. She's on the West Coast, so she helps provide a bit of diversity in terms of time zone, as well as her knowledge of the disability and arts field. And I also want to just give a shout out that I am on the East Coast, but my family is from your part of the world, Eastern Montana, some in North Dakota, no one in South Dakota, but we seem to have relatives from all across the northern tier. And I have been through South Dakota, but I haven't been able to see all the beautiful sights. Okay, so back to the presentation. Just a little bit about the National Endowment for the Arts. We were established by Congress in 1965. We're an independent federal agency that's the largest funder of the arts in communities nationwide, and a catalyst for public and private support for the arts. And I'd like to just note that Arts South Dakota is a grantee, as well as the South Dakota Arts Council. We do a lot of work with the state arts councils, and Kate has been a great partner in this. Our office provides resources to make the arts accessible for people with disabilities, veterans, older adults, and those living in institutional settings. We provide assistance and training, technical assistance and training to applicants, grantees, artists with disabilities, NEA staff, as well as the state arts agency and regional arts organizations. And I'd like to give a shout out to Arts Midwest, which is working with us on providing those types of resources throughout their region, including the South Dakota Arts Council. So for today, we will talk about disability, some of the estimates of disability in the population, talk about the laws and regulations, which are requirements for you as arts organizations, as well as some of the benefits. We talk about the carrot and the stick. We'll talk about the carrot, which are all the reasons why accessibility can be a benefit to your organization, but then also the laws that you must follow. We'll talk about some of the how-tos on how to make your projects accessible physically and programmatically, and then we'll provide some resources. And then, of course, the Q&A. So we want to clarify the accessibility requirements and legislation, identify examples of accessibility, and then share resources. So I guess I just kind of said all of that. So I will turn it over to Katharine, who will talk about the statistics.
Thanks, Beth. To provide a little bit of background, I wanted to share some of the latest statistics based on data from 2021. Nationally, about 27% of adults in the United States are living with disabilities, and that is 1 in 4. And as we know, as we get older, we're more likely to encounter disabilities. So for communities where individuals are 65 or over, 44% of individuals in that age group have a disability. And this makes the disability community the largest minority group in the United States. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about what this looks like in South Dakota. So the estimates are fairly similar to the national estimates. In South Dakota, 24% of adults have a disability. And some of the more common disabilities that we see are people who have a cognitive disability, that's 11%. And this is individuals who may have a serious difficulty remembering or thinking or making decisions. The second most common is people with mobility or physical disabilities, 10%. And then 6% of adults in South Dakota have a hearing disability and 3% a vision disability. Now, there are lots of different types of disabilities. I think one of the most commonly recognized are mobility and physical disabilities. And that may be somewhat because it's a more apparent disability. But there are lots of other disabilities that are not as apparent, including people who have chronic health conditions like diabetes, arthritis, or long-haul COVID is becoming more prevalent. There are also people who may be deaf or hard of hearing, people who have low vision or blind, people who may have speech difficulties. And as Beth mentions, although I hardly ever notice it, she is a stutterer. And there are some other disabilities where the definitions, and even with some of the ones that I've mentioned, it starts to get a little tricky and the lines get a little bit blurry in terms of the actual terms or categories. And a lot of that has to do with the way things are defined for how they're measured or for program eligibility. But I wanted to share some of the different disabilities that really represent people who may think differently, how they process information is different, and how they interact or behave in the world may look a little bit different. One of the terms that, and feel free to put in the chat or ask questions about some of these distinctions if you like, but some of these terms may be a little bit newer to you. A term that's gaining a lot of movement, particularly for autistic advocates, is neurodiverse or neurodivergent. And this also relates to, just as I was saying, some of the differences in the way that we process information or sort of look and interact with the world. So this can also include people that may have learning disabilities, like ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia. There are also other cognitive or intellectual disabilities that really look at more the decision-making or memory issues. And this can include people, this can also include people who may have acquired a brain injury, people who are experiencing levels of dementia, or when we talk about intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, it can include people who may have like Down syndrome as an example. And last but certainly not least is to also consider people who may be dealing with mental health conditions, or sometimes referred to as psychiatric disabilities. And this can include things like anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress. So one of the reasons I like to share statistics, besides the fact that I'm a little bit of a nerd, is that I think it helps indicate that really people with disabilities are part of your communities. And whether you may know it or not, you are likely engaging people with disabilities in some way, as staff, as volunteers, as board members, as artists that you work with, students, or audiences.
Okay, well, I will jump in to just give one more set of bullets on why disability is really important part of your community. It's part of equity work. Accessibility is an organizational asset that if you make things accessible for people with disabilities, it can help others. Like we all know the curb cut effect, that once curb cuts were put in urban environments, it meant that people with roller bags and strollers were able to get up to curbs. Also, if you see an airport, all of the things that you appreciate, like the rolling sidewalks or the lack of stairs, the prevalence of elevators, that helps people with disabilities, but it helps everyone else. Same thing with captions. We're seeing that with everything that's captioned. It's not just for people who are hard of hearing or deaf. It helps everyone. Disability is a vital and often overlooked part of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There's a lot of attention paid to diversity, equity, inclusion, and we always want to make sure you put the I or the A on that for accessibility. And we have a colleague, Lawrence Carter-Long, who uses the phrase, disability, put the D in diversity or in DEIA. So it's really important to all make sure that you include that in your efforts. Disability can provide a unique perspective in artistic creation. There's a whole genre called disability arts, with the people whose art that they create is shaped by their disability experience. We also have fields of deaf theater, physically integrated dance, and so on. And then also, now that we have virtual access, it allows for a wider reach and opens up your work to new audiences. We saw during COVID, when everything went online, people with disabilities were able to access content that they weren't able to before due to various reasons for not being able to go in person to events. And so that's a whole new audience that you might want to make sure that you're continuing to engage in some way. So that's it for the carrots. We're now going to get into the stick, the accessibility laws and regulations, and why why being accessible will help you comply with requirements, whether you receive federal funding, state funding, or not. And I just want to point out that we have a set of downloadable accessibility symbols that you have probably seen. These are available through the Graphic Artists Guild, actually through a contract that we funded back in the 1990s. And we have the symbols here that you can use it to show your accessibility in your marketing materials and in posters and things and signage around your buildings. So it's starting from the left, it's a symbol for people who have low vision or blindness, closed captioning, braille, physical accessibility, sign language interpretation, audio description, and assisted listening devices. And we will send out the links for anytime you see a blue hyperlink in this, we will send that out to you and actually put it in the chat where we can. So the first law that I want to talk about is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. You may have heard of 504 plans for kids in school. This comes out of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, and in our case, this would be NEA events, and those receiving federal financial assistance, such as direct grantees, state arts agencies, etc. And it can also include money that you get from your state arts agency that trickles down. So be sure to keep in mind where the funding is coming from. You might have to comply with 504. This was passed in 1973. And if you saw the film Crip Camp, which was an Oscar nominee from a few years ago, it talks about the protests that the disability rights community engaged in to get them to implement the regulations. So that law got a lot of attention, is getting a lot of attention through that film and through historic looks back at the disability rights movement. But they found that even when the Rehabilitation Act was implemented and enforced, it wasn't enough. So they continued to advocate and passed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which kind of covered everybody else because the Rehabilitation Act was only federal funding. So Title II is for state and local government services, so the state arts agencies and locals and anything that they do. And then Title III is everybody else for places of public accommodation and services. So any kind of commercial facilities, museums, performing arts, theaters, galleries, and anything on in campuses, classrooms, etc. Actually, universities, publicly funded universities, are covered by the Rehabilitation Act as well. So either way, you are likely to have to comply with these laws. All organizations are legally required to provide reasonable and necessary accommodations for staff and visitors with disabilities. And there are lots of resources out there to help you with this process. We're available. There are resources on our website. And but the rest of this presentation will go through some more of these. So I'll pass it over to Katharine to talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Beth. This is Katharine. So I guess I'll go back to the carrot a little bit. It's useful to have the legislation and to also understand that there are requirements, but I also want you to think about who you might be missing out on when you're not accessible and who is not attending or participating in your events if accessibility isn't there. And we'll break that down a little bit more in a moment. So I think that this is more of how can you create a welcoming environment that specifically invites people with disabilities to participate in your events. And one of the ways that you can do that is to have an accessibility statement, as well as related policies around accessibility. And you've probably often seen accessibility statements that say something about we welcome or we are committed to, making sure that all individuals, including people with disabilities, so on and so forth. And one of the ways to really get feedback or find out what might be missing is to have an access or accessibility advisory committee that includes people with disabilities to really help you understand ways that you can be more inclusive. And one of the more important and also can be required elements is to have a designated staff person that oversees accessibility, and they're often called the accessibility coordinator. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So the accessibility coordinator, although this can often be a requirement as part of Section 504 or the ADA, and most definitely if you receive funding from the NEA, the accessibility coordinator does not have to be a separate position. It just means that there's a point of contact for making sure that questions around accessibility are being answered and that any requested accommodations are being arranged. So it's also important to make sure that this information about whoever your accessibility coordinator is, including their name and contact information, is available on your website and promotional materials. And we recommend that you include both email and telephone number because there may be differences in the best way an individual is able to communicate. So kind of building on the element of making sure that the name and information about your accessibility coordinator, as well as access information is more easily available to the public, is to, as Beth mentioned in a previous slide, one way to kind of get that access information across in a simplified and sort of easier way, if you're working with, you know, like a postcard or a smaller poster, is to use those disability symbols that indicate to individuals what access services will be provided for a particular event. And then again, to have that contact information somewhere where people are going to see it right away and not be hunting through your website or trying to figure out from a promotional material who they need to talk to if they have a question or need to request a specific accommodation.
Great, thank you. It's all great information on the, you know, some of the generalities around making sure that you are fully inclusive and being in having a welcoming environment. And part of that is being able to just get in the door. So some of the things to think about when looking at the physical accessibility of your facility. You know, there are guides out there. There's the ADA design standards, there's other resources, but here we're going to provide just some basics. So are the facilities where your activities are taking place, including historic facilities, which pose additional challenges, are they accessible to people with physical and mobility disabilities? They may be staff, volunteers, artists, participants, audiences, and visitors. And then some of the basics are, you know, can you get into the building? Ground level, no step entry, ramped access, elevators to get in and through the building. Directional signage for accessible entrances and paths, because one of the most frustrating things for someone who has a mobility disability, who uses a chair or a walker, is approaching a building and not knowing where the accessible entrance is. You might face a whole set of stairs and you don't know which way to go, and it can be extremely exhausting or painful to have to walk all the way around the building to find the accessible entrance. And even to have that information on your website that the accessible entrance is off of X street as opposed to Y street. So it's really important. If you don't have a mobility disability, if you've had a broken leg or anything else, you know how hard it is to manage that process. Do you have integrated and dispersed wheelchair seating in meeting or assembly areas? This is referring to auditoriums and theater seating. So not just having everybody in the back or in the front, if possible, to have it interspersed throughout. Is your box office accessible? You know, do you have a low enough window or another way for someone to purchase tickets? Consider your stage and your backstage. Anything in the back, anything for your artists. There is a Midwestern musician in Duluth, Minnesota, Galen Lee, a folk musician who refuses to perform in any venue where she cannot access the stage with dignity. You know, they've offered to boost her up and you know, to put her on this, to lift her up to the stage, and that's not an accessible, or it's not an acceptable option. Stages and backstages need access, and restrooms and dressing rooms. Are your meeting rooms accessible as well for staff? And one other example, from Broadway. We know that if you've been to New York for Broadway shows, you know that those are very narrow, closed-in buildings, and it's hard to make them they were built a long time ago. It's hard to make them accessible, but it can be done. And Ellie Stroker, who won the Tony for the musical Oklahoma, she won supporting actress, forget the title. She, you know, they made sure in the shows that she's done, they made sure to make her accessible dressing rooms and an easy way to get on and off the stage. So those are all things to consider. are your display cases in museums and galleries, are they accessible? Are your exhibit areas and your counters? Restrooms and water fountains. That actually goes back to the early days of the ADA. It was just always, are your restrooms and water fountains accessible? Now that we don't use water fountains as often, it's just kind of interesting to hear water fountains referred to, but we all still have them and they need to be accessible. Accessible emergency exits and audiovisual emergency alarms, and also accessible parking if you offer parking. Not all facilities do, especially if they're in urban areas. And then again, for artists and participants, if you have studios and classrooms and workspaces, and then residencies. I don't know if any of you represent an artist residency or artist community. There are considerations for the artists' living spaces. Often they are in rural areas, out in the woods, in historic homes. This can be a real challenge to make sure that you can offer an accessible living space to someone who may use a wheelchair, for one example. But you also have to think about whether or not the people can interact, the artists can interact with the other artists. If the communal and social spaces are in an inaccessible part of the building, that can pose a challenge. So just consider all of those things. You can always reach out to us if you have questions. And make sure that you have accessible options for anyone in your residency. And then your staff. Are your offices and other parts of your facility accessible? Do you offer remote work or hybrid access for employees who may have difficulty accessing your space? Or it's also a great option for people with disabilities that may have difficulty accessing the workplace or concerns about COVID transmission. And then do you have a plan for accommodating employees who acquire disabilities due to injury or illness? You may say that, okay, our office is on the second floor without an elevator, but we don't have anyone with a disability, but someone could be injured or acquire a disability in some way. So all things to consider with your space. And but now I will turn it over to Katharine to talk about program accessibility on that side of the equation.
Thank you, Beth. This is Katharine again. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about, once you're able to get in the door, whatever that door may look like, how are the project activities themselves accessible to members of the disability community? So how is the activity and content being shared, communicated, and implemented? Next slide. Communication access is an important part of programmatic accessibility. For example, people who are deaf or maybe hard of hearing, sign language interpretation and assistive listening devices can be very important for them to experience the same activity in a similar way. Transcripts, captions can also be very useful for people who have difficulty hearing, but they're also helpful for people in general. And unfortunately, I don't have the statistic on me at the moment, but I was reading something recently about how high the percentage is of people who use captions. So some of these things that may have originally been thought of for people with disabilities are really benefiting many others, including also people who may process information differently or have different learning styles. Captions and transcripts can also be really useful. And for people who may have low vision or are blind, you want to also think of including audio or visual description, which is part of what Beth and I did earlier when we were introducing ourselves and sort of describing our appearance. And it's important to do that with other images that you might be using. And also think about if there's any room for tactile opportunities, so such as feeling fabrics of a costume or models of pieces. You sometimes will see that in museums. And I think this is really exciting in terms of thinking of accessibility, because you're able to be creative, which is what we all do in the arts. So I would really think of this as an opportunity of what does this other element that may also make things accessible for people with disabilities, what layer does that add to your arts activity? And because program accessibility is such a big area and so specific to what your arts activities may be, we have lots more examples. And I will also say that these are examples, and this is not a comprehensive list, although hopefully it gets you to think about different areas that you might not have before. So some other things to keep in mind, particularly for people who may have cognitive difficulties, are to have your materials in plain language, which translates to about a 3rd or 5th grade reading level. To think about having sensory-friendly programming, which some of you may be familiar with, where there's reduced lights, reduction of sound. There's warnings for strobes or flashing lights, having events when you're in person be fragrance-free, or, this is particularly important, I think, for like soaps. It's sort of the big thing as well, to check on if for your bathrooms, whether that would be an issue, any of the scents that are being used. And then also for meetings to sort of, or longer events, to make sure that there are breaks sort of built in, which benefit people with various disabilities. And sort of related to some of the sensory friendly, also having maybe quiet hours or quiet spaces where people can go if they're feeling overwhelmed. And having some pre-visit materials, such as if you're a museum, or that you have a specific location that you use all the time, to sort of set the expectations of what it's going to be like to get there and move throughout your experience.
Can I chime in real quick, Katharine?
Yes.
One of the, another benefit of having like a more flexible and relaxed environment, like the term sensory friendly has been used quite a bit, but starting in the UK, they started using the term relaxed performance. And it also has the idea that you can get up and move around if you need to. Some people have a hard time sitting for a long time. And even if you do have an intermission, it might not be a long enough. The amount of time to have to sit is it might be too long. So some organizations are saying, if you need to get up and move around, please do so. It can definitely be disruptive, but changing the perception and just the culture of the arts can help make it more easier for more people to participate. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Beth. And I also want to give a note, particularly as events continue to be virtual or to have hybrid activities, which is great for one thing, because Beth and I get to be here presenting to you all because it's a virtual event. But there are some things to keep in mind for electronic accessibility, which can include your websites, films or videos, podcasts, and again, sort of virtual meetings or events. So for websites, you want to think about whether someone who is using a screen reader is going to be able to easily navigate the site. For online documents as well as websites, having alternative text for images is really important. You also want to think about having accessible fonts and appropriate color contrast. And again, some of the other access services that we've already mentioned such as captioning or sign language interpretation and audio or visual description, should also be used both in in-person and virtual spaces. So before we close out, I also want to mention a few things about the accommodations process. And like we discussed earlier, in addition to making sure that the accessibility coordinator's information is easy to find, it's also useful to describe what your accommodation process is, to include maybe access services or options that will already be included, as well as to give a time frame or to have a statement about what they do if they need to request an accommodation. And accommodations or access services can also be provided for specific dates. You sometimes see that with performances. I've seen it at our local movie theater where they have certain days, all the movies are captioned, or whatever your activity might be, to make sure that if you're going to have a specific access service, let's say you're going to have a sign language interpreter, that you make it really clear when that's going to happen. And again, to also think about what layers of accessibility beyond physical accessibility can you include as part of every activity, and just sort of your process for planning and implementing different arts activities. And again, hopefully, is this the 5th time I've said it? You're getting the idea that you want to have an accessibility coordinator, or at the very least, have a statement about how people go about requesting a reasonable accommodation for your activity. And as we discussed earlier as well, one of the, best ways to really find out what you may be missing or what kinds of things to think about to improve the accessibility of your arts activities is to engage people with disabilities and have them represented throughout your organization in different ways. And there's a phrase that's very popular within the disability community, which is nothing about us without us, which is, as it sounds, that if you're trying to make things more accessible for people with disabilities, have people with disabilities involved in that conversation. So think about where you can do that engagement within your organization, maybe with how you recruit or how you engage people with your boards, if any staff, volunteers may be willing to share their experience. You can conduct a community needs assessment or partner with organizations that are serving people with disabilities. That can be a really important asset in reaching out to the community and gaining some expertise. And also, don't forget, there are disabled artists. So also think about how you can collaborate or bring in artists with disabilities.
Okay, I just want to piggyback on that a little bit. The phrase "nothing about us without us" has shifted over the years. I mean, that was a big part of the disability rights movement in the 1970s and beyond. But most recently, they say "nothing without us." Make sure that people with disabilities is not just involved in the elements of your organization or policies that involve them, but include them in everything. Make sure the disability perspective is always front of mind when making policy decisions or activities, and just always including people with disabilities as part of those decision-making groups, whether it's as staff or volunteers or any of these other ideas listed here. So thanks, Katharine. So that's it for for our presentation, but we do have some resources we want to share. So Katharine will put these links in the chat, but this will also be available afterward in our PowerPoint. We have a brief accessibility checklist, which was really helpful for just kind of doing a quick assessment of your organization. There are other accessibility resources on our website. We have a resource we created toward the beginning of the pandemic on how to make your virtual events accessible. And I just want to say that we haven't updated it in a couple of years, so it might be a little out of date, but it just definitely goes through a lot of the things that you might want to consider, and hopefully, some of the links would be useful. And then the Section 504 self-evaluation workbook is required by all grantees. A self-evaluation is required, and this workbook can be used. So if you have a grant from us, we recommend that you use this workbook. There are others out there, but you have to save it and keep it either in your electronic or physical files, and make it available if requested by the public or if you're audited. And then we will be updating it. It's a bit out of date, but we're waiting on our new regulations to be implemented before we can do that. So I just want to give the caveat that we know it's a little out of date. And then we also, last spring, a year ago, we did a webinar with all of the civil rights requirements. So it goes into what we covered, but a little more in depth for what is required for NEA grantees. And then the link to the downloadable accessibility symbols. And I just want to give a little shout out to our grant opportunities that are upcoming. First is our Grants for Arts Projects, which is our main grant category. You apply under your specific artistic discipline or multidisciplinary. And then that deadline is July 6th. That's the initial deadline to indicate your intention to apply. And then a couple weeks later, you will upload the rest of your information. And then our creative placemaking grant, Our Town, which is a larger grant that requires a partnership between a municipal organization or agency such as city or county government, along with an arts organization to do creative placemaking work in your community. That deadline is August 3rd. And then our guidelines for the next year will be released in December. So keep your eye out for that. And you can subscribe to our newsletter to be notified, along with all sorts of other great information about our work at arts.gov. And you can always reach out to us at our general inbox or to one of us specifically. And we're always available to help. I'll leave this up on the screen for a minute if you want to take that down, and then I will stop sharing and answer any questions. I don't think I see any.
Yeah, it's just been all really positive chat. Just thanking you for all the wonderful information. One question that had been posed to me by someone that couldn't join today was, do you have any tips or recommendations for presenting organizations that don't control the venues that they use, that have concerns about the accessibility? Are there any things you recommend that they do to help encourage the changes in some of the facilities that they use?
Yeah, we always recommend that you build into your contract with the organizations that you are contracting with or renting from, to make sure that it's clear in the contract who is responsible for what elements of accessibility. Who will provide assisted listening devices or captioning equipment or the captioning or any of that. It needs to be thought out and included in the contract. Another, it's one of the things that we get in our accessibility questionnaires that grantees complete is, they say that we don't, we're renting the space, so we don't have to be compliant. It's like, no, you still have to be compliant. You still have to provide access. And I mean, the basic requirement is non-discrimination. So it is important to both you and the group that you're renting from to be accessible and not violate any of the laws. So just remind them that it is the law, and then work together to see how you can do that. And we'll talk in a minute, because I wanted to pose a question to Katharine about she knows this is coming, about what value partnerships have and how important that is for, and how you can do work together with your partners to ensure access. But I want to see, there is another question before Katharine and I, just so I can make sure we get it.
I'm just having them retype it. Something went weird with the Q&A, so.
Yeah, the one from Kate Moran. Okay. Well, but while we wait, Katharine, we've been talking about, one of the things that might be of concern is what are some, for arts organizations that have very limited budgets, what are some of the solutions to providing access? And I can chime in, but I know you had some ideas.
Yeah, I was just making sure that the question wasn't coming in. Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I get a lot, and a big concern, particularly of smaller nonprofits, is one, not knowing where to find a resource such as a sign language interpreter, and then the cost associated with that. So in terms of, finding particular resources, there are some like registries or known companies for like audio description or sign language interpretation. And the issue of location has become a little less of a barrier because of the ability of virtual and remote provision of services like that, including, captioning, sign language interpretation, things like that. And the costs associated are generally low for most improvements in accessibility. There's a lot that can be done in terms of creating that welcoming environment. And to your point, Beth, about partnering, there are organizations that really have a lot of expertise as to what works or doesn't work for people with specific disabilities. And some organizations also have like may loan equipment, like assistive listening devices. If that's something that you don't have in your budget at this time to sort of purchase equipment like that. So I'm thinking of like independent living centers are a really great resource and are in every state in various locations. And there's a lot of other organizations. And if people have a particular question, they can fill out to reach out to us. If you want to find out maybe if there's anything in your state. I still don't have every state memorized and every resource, but I can look it up to find something that is within your location. But I think partnering is a really important key, particularly if you're a smaller group. The way things get done is through building resources together and leaning on each other. And there's expertise, but there's also just, sometimes locations or equipment, promotion, particularly if you're trying to build your audiences to include more people with disabilities, that it's really important to find those organizations and to take the time to really build those relationships.
Yeah, it's definitely important. Just look at what state agencies are there in the state government besides the Arts Council. There's every state is different, but they usually have some kind of disability services office, disability policy office. There's also the services for the deaf. I was looking up where the school for the deaf was, and there's a connection to the state services for the deaf, and they might have good resource. There's also if you're looking for interpreters, the National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. Is that the name, Katharine? That has a directory of interpreting companies, and they would likely have remote interpreting options. I know that when we work with states that don't have big metropolitan areas, it's often hard to find interpreters, but remote interpreting has been a life changer. When we think of the silver linings from COVID, I think, making that a standard practice has been really, really great for the, remote interpreting and video relay interpreting has been used in the deaf community, but it's just now becoming more known. And also captioning. The auto caption feature is, it's a little bit contested about whether that's better than a live captioner, but and also live captioning can be done remotely as well. But having the auto captions as a backup is great. And the technology is getting much better. So always having that feature turned on when you do a virtual event allows people to turn that on, even if you don't hire a captioner. So I don't know if that answered anyone's question. It was just one that we wanted to bring up. And if there are organizations in a city or at the city or county level, or groups like Arts South Dakota that can purchase captioning equipment, audio description equipment that can be loaned out. That's really helpful. I've seen other states do that, other communities do that, and it's really, really helpful. So we don't have Kate Moran's question. I saw the test pop up in the Q&A and then it disappeared. So anything you want to type into the chat would be great.
And I think too, Beth, I would add, particularly if people are applying for a grant, to think of, adding an item for access services, because one of the things when I'm providing technical assistance, one of the things that comes up is people realize that they hadn't factored that into their budget or into their grant application, and now they're getting an offer letter, and if it's federal funding from us or funding that is funneled through from us, like if you're getting it from your state arts agency, they're most likely using NAA funds for at least some of that granting. They find out, oh, I have to do this and I didn't think about it. And I do get some people that are a little freaked out when when they first realize this and trying to figure out where that they're going to find the money. So I do encourage people to sort of think about it ahead of time so that you have it there. And also just to do a little bit of research and to find out in your area how much like paid for services like getting a sign language interpreter costs, because it really varies by area what the costs are. There's not like a standard fee for a lot of those services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also put 2 links in the chat. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center, located in Boulder, provides services for your region. They have a lot of great information on their website. The ADA National Network, they're a part of the ADA National Network. There are 10 regional arts, or not arts, it's just disability centers, technical assistance centers, and they've got a lot of great resources on their website as well. And I see Kate's question: where are the resources for disabled producers and artists? We have a Disability Pride Festival. So I'm trying to think of what some of those might be, and we can always email Andrew and Kate with responses to that. Unless Katharine has any thoughts, I'm connected with the people that run the Disability Unite Festival in New York City. I could always put you in touch with them to see if they have any thoughts on that. They have a lot of local resources, but they might know some national. And I know that they're looking at just different funders throughout the state. I'm sure there's many people that would be very excited about it. Local and county funders would probably be excited by it. So if you're interested, we can. I can send you the information. Actually, if you just Google Disability Unite Festival, but I can connect you with the directors. And that's also virtual, so you can watch it. You can live stream it. It'll be sometime in July. I think we're done. I think we're at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, this is Perfect. Thank you so much, Katharine and Beth, and thank you to Kate with the South Dakota Arts Council for helping us to get this session started and organized, and for really starting this conversation. You know, as we all know, this isn't a one-time thing that we solve all the problems and move on and don't think about it again. It's an ongoing process for all of us, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise, and all the resources that you provided today. So thank you again so much to Beth and to Katharine. As they mentioned, please reach out to any of us at Art South Dakota or the South Dakota Arts Council. And if you have any other ideas for webinars or other professional development that would be helpful to you, please reach out to me at andrew@artsouthdakota.org. And most importantly, just thank you. It was great seeing the names of all the folks attending today, and some familiar names and faces and some new names. And just thank you for everything you do to keep South Dakota creative. It's been a tough 3 or 4 years for creatives. It's never an easy time to be a creative, whether in the nonprofit world or as an individual artist. And we really thank you for everything you're doing for South Dakota. So thank you all again, and we'll keep the conversation going, and we hope to see you at some of the future sessions in this series.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.